Good morning, everybody. It's the 10th of October 2024, and I'm with Dr Mel McCann this morning. Dr Mel, thank you for coming on to this program and talking to people across Australia and sometimes in our broadcasts across the world, of course, because they're interested in what people like yourself have got to say. But it's been a long and difficult 4 years for all of us. And I think probably in political terms, for me, it's probably been the most intense time of having to stand up on behalf of not only the vaccine injured, but people across Australia and across the world who have been damaged by these vaccines. Having said that, since the start, I've been puzzled about the lack of doctors standing up about the impact of the vaccines, increased rates in heart attacks, strokes, cancer, dementia, and sudden death. Who's heard of adult sudden death syndrome? I want to know your story going back, all the way back to the beginning of 2019-20, and how you actually came to the conclusions that you came to and began the fight that you began all that time ago.
Yeah, well, thanks so much for having me on, Russell, and thank you for all of your efforts that you have made over the past 4 years. I think it's been, you've been a real hope and inspiration to many of the injured. I know from what they've said to me how much it's meant to them that you have stood up for what's happened. So thank you. Yeah, well, gosh, so much has happened in the past 4 years, and I think medically, it's been one of the most difficult times for me as well. Really an extraordinary time over the past sort of 4 years. But I guess just to go back quickly, I guess to summarise it best would be to say 2019, 2020, I was as fearful of COVID as anyone. I was as enthusiastic about the vaccine, I would say, as anyone. And there was so much going on in those first few years of 2020 and then early 21. It was almost difficult to keep up with it. So the constantly changing guidelines, there was a lot of impact actually on general practices. You know, every single time those requirements for isolation and travel changed. So it was really constant meetings, constant changes to our triage processes, constantly reevaluating to make sure like our cleaning processes, our screening and triage of patients who could enter the practice, who had to be seen by a phone consult based on had they travelled internationally, had they had contact with anyone. So it was just such a busy time. It was a really frightening time. Some of the early, Facebook posts and social media, what I would now call, misinformation, was actually coming out at the beginning suggesting an infection fatality rate of even up to 9%. So it really was quite terrifying, I would say, that whole early time. And then, when vaccines were announced, I was definitely enthusiastic about that. I was, and again, I would look back now and I certainly don't feel that way about the vaccines now, but I've always been very enthusiastic about vaccination. I'm the sort of person that would have at least one, often more than one flu vaccine every year. So that was, I guess, the perspective that I was coming from. And I was, I guess, enthusiastic about the role that general practice might play in protecting the public and in, playing a part in that vaccine rollout. So that was initially my feeling towards all of it. And it really wasn't until getting into, say, the last quarter of 2021, and I'm in a rural area, and in Queensland, I guess the rollout generally was more delayed. Access to Pfizer in particular was more delayed, probably only until the second half of 21. And uptake in our area, for whatever reason, was lower, probably an access issue, I would think. So it really wasn't until there was that real push towards mandates, actually. So we're talking like September, October, November, say, of 21, that many people in my area were starting to become vaccinated. And so they were coming in after having their vaccine. And at this stage, mostly for staffing issues, but for a few other reasons, I had pulled back on my clinic actually being involved in running vaccine clinics. Part of that was an objection to the mandatory policies. as enthusiastic as I was about the vaccines themselves, mandates I saw as ethically unacceptable. And so I personally, I didn't want to participate after that point. And it was also extremely tedious for staff. You might remember back in 21 where there was these constantly changing recommendations for the AstraZeneca as the clotting risk was discovered. And sometimes these changes were being announced literally through Facebook. It would be discovered, okay, now only aged under 60s can have it, or now the cutoff is no one under the age of 50. And so that was really challenging. So by that point, we weren't...
Just on that point of, what do you mean the clotting risk were discovered?
Well, it had become accepted that there was a risk of clotting, the TTS, the thrombocytopenia with thrombosis syndrome that was associated with the AstraZeneca vaccine.
And I don't think the general public knew that.
Well, I think it was fairly late that it was accepted. Internationally, there had been some cases. I believe it was first perhaps discussed in the Senate, maybe it was around March or April of 21, that there had been these cases. And so ATAGI was changing their recommendations to the public based on that kind of emerging risk profile. And from memory, perhaps it was around perhaps June or July of 21, where ATAGI really came out and said, and again, there was confusion around this because I believe it was ATAGI that first said that the Pfizer is the preferred vaccine for anyone under the age of 60. But we then had the complexity of Scott Morrison and other officials coming out and saying, really in confusion, what would have caused confusion, I believe, to say, well, any vaccine is the right vaccine for you to get. Talk to your doctor about it.
And the mantra was then that they were safe and effective.
Exactly, that's right, yeah. And the best vaccine is the one that's in your arm. And I think perhaps dismissive of that very real risk of clotting, whereas at that point, ATAGI was saying, look, there is a clotting risk. It's not the AstraZeneca is not the preferred vaccine. And, unfortunately, there were deaths in young people from that clotting risk after that date. And, I think really we can look back now and say, well, that vaccine certainly, at the point that clotting risk was known in those age groups, it shouldn't have been offered to younger age groups.
That is disgraceful.
I agree. Yes, I agree. Looking back now, I find it really disturbing how much was known that was not communicated to doctors or the public. And as another example of that, Russell, and this one really irks me, is that you might recall early when the Pfizer vaccine was being rolled out internationally, that there was reports in Norway of deaths in nursing home residents. Perhaps it was 30 deaths that had been reported soon after that very first rollout. And so the TGA actually announced that on their website and said, yes, we're looking into this. And it was perhaps only a week or two later that they then put another announcement out publicly. And all of this is publicly available, of course, to say we've investigated, there is no association between the Pfizer vaccine and those deaths in those elderly patients, sort of end of story. But down the track, I made an FOI request to better understand what was the investigation around those deaths and what was learned from that. And so that is also publicly available, Russell, on the FOI disclosure log of the TGA. And what was found from that Freedom of Information request was a range of emails between the Norway regulator, the Pfizer representative, and John Skerritt and the TGA. And it's very obvious when you read those that there was really no question that there had been a death rate of approximately 1 in 1,000 elderly that had died after the Pfizer vaccine. It was quite clear from the email trail to say, frail elderly patients who had basically like a too strong an immune response to the vaccine, in a sense, that they became unwell, dehydrated, went into renal failure and died. So there was a clear sort of mechanism for how these deaths had occurred. And that just really bothers me, because that was absolutely unequivocally known to the regulators. And it may have still been the case that, okay, 1 in 1,000 that would die from the vaccine. In the most vulnerable elderly, the risk from death from COVID was perhaps 1 in 100. So maybe that was still a favourable risk benefit, possibly, if every single elderly person caught COVID. But it seems to me as a medical professional, it seems quite dishonest to not tell doctors this, to not tell the public this, because potentially they were preventable deaths then. We could have ensured that if someone was choosing to have the vaccine, that they were well hydrated, that they didn't have background, reduced kidney function, things like this. And absolutely that should have been part of the consent and decision making of the elderly and their families to say, well, this is a known risk of death, and it's not an insignificant risk. I mean, 1 in 1,000 risk of death, that's quite high. So yeah, I do find it really really egregious to look back at this stage and say, well, all of these, there were, and that's just one example of many actually that I've discovered through this whole sort of legal process of information that was known to the regulators, but that was not communicated to doctors and was not communicated to the public.
Now, at the time, didn't you do an audit of your own practice?
Yes. So, so in around November of 21, that was prompted by, so first of all, that was prompted by the changed pattern of adverse events that I was seeing around that time. So literally so many phone calls of patients ringing with chest pain, so many patients we were needing to call ambulances for because they were coming in with chest pain, people calling with miscarriages, blood clots in young healthy people, and there was just a similar story that was being told. Well, I had my vaccine a week ago, could it be related to that? I had the vaccine 2 days ago, I felt unwell since, now I have this. So there was just that repeated story, and that is not something that I've ever seen before. That's not something that I've seen with, the flu vaccine campaigns where we're doing, hundreds and hundreds of flu vaccines throughout a winter period. We just don't see dozens of people coming in with chest pains and clots and just reporting all of these types of events. So that concerned me. And it was around that time that I went to have a look on the TGA's DAN database, which I hadn't looked at for many months, really, since the very beginning. And I was just so shocked to see that the TGA had received reports of multiple cases of cardiac arrests in young people. There were several reports of deaths in young people. There was a death reported in it was a 14-year-old, a couple of extremely severe events. And so then the next step really was to take a bit of an objective look at what I was seeing, amongst my own patient cohort. So I did that, and at that point, I just became really, really alarmed at the numbers, the information that was being given to guide consent and to guide risk benefit, because it was at that time that it was still being suggested that the myocarditis risk was perhaps 30 in a million, and so it was just statistically impossible in my very small, tiny rural area and my very small cohort of, patients in my practice from that area. Statistically, it's just completely impossible that there could be, 3 or 4 cases of myocarditis and for that rate to be true. And so it was then that I started, as best as I could, discussing that with, colleagues and people that are, colleagues that I had connections with around Australia, and just asking what they were seeing, and other practice owners asking what they were saying. And it's probably important to point out that they were really difficult conversations, because there was this enormous fear, I think, of discussing anything that might be adverse to the vaccination campaign. And that was because AHPRA had been very clear that if doctors spoke ill of the vaccines, that there was the risk of regulatory action. So it was my observation, it was my experience that a lot of colleagues were equally concerned behind closed doors, and within complete confidence, they would express what they were seeing and they would express the concerns that they had. But this was just not something that could be discussed in any way publicly. And so that was really difficult. And so I felt my next step from there was to raise this with the officials, so to appropriately write to them with both what I had observed, what my concerns were, what I was seeing on their own database of these really alarming cases of deaths and serious events in young people. And so I wrote to Minister Hunt and John Skerritt, and that was in about November of 21. And I did not get the response from them that I had expected. So I had certainly, look, I think I thought that perhaps there would be a response that would be a bit more along the lines of, yes, we've thoroughly investigated these cases. We've thoroughly investigated, you know, this death that you've pointed out, these cases of cardiac arrest in young people, and you know, of course, they can't completely breach confidentiality of the individual cases, but perhaps some reassurance that, you know, perhaps these people were palliative, perhaps these were young people who were at the end of life or had very serious underlying medical conditions. And so the death was not entirely unexpected, and therefore to die or have a cardiac arrest in close proximity to a vaccine, it was equally likely that that person was going to die anyway, that had a life-threatening illness. But the response that I got was essentially to say, young people die every year. Therefore, if we vaccinate a population, we're going to expect to see more and more deaths being reported after the vaccine. You know, but sadly enough, young people die every year. And that just really, a lot of my perception of this whole thing and my confidence in the job that the regulators were doing in analysing this data, that was a real 180 for me, because that's just not how pharmacovigilance is done. Yes, it is true that there might be, I think they quoted, John Skerritt quoted perhaps 238 young people die suddenly every year. But just to do a really simple statistical analysis of that, that might equate to, say, an annual unexpected death rate of, say, 1 in 10,000 for any individual teenager, for example, that number. Which might equate to, say, a 1 in 100,000 risk of death unexpectedly and shockingly in any 1 month. But so for two things to occur in close proximity to each other with what they call a temporal relationship, that's the most important factor of looking at whether a drug has caused an adverse event, is how soon afterwards did the event occur. Because the shorter that time frame is, you're looking at a smaller and smaller statistical probability of someone dying suddenly and unexpectedly for an unknown reason within that time frame. So, you know, if in a month maybe it's 1 in 10,000, well, if it's in a 2-week period, it might be that it's a 1 in 200,000 rate that a young person suddenly and unexpectedly could die in that time period. It's then a multiplication of odds, so that you then say, right, well, within that 2-week time period, what percentage of people, young teenagers, were having the vaccine? And that might only be, say, 1 in 10 or 1 in 100 or something like that. So you then multiply those odds together. What are the odds that 1% or 2% of people who are having the vaccine, that it happened to coincide that person had a rare, unexpected risk and died from an unknown cause, and those two things coincided. And so then when you multiply those odds, you're talking about, you know, less than a 1 in 1 million event of those two things coinciding. And at the time I wrote the letter, I was raising multiple cases of this happening. So multiple cases of cardiac arrest, multiple cases of deaths. The statistical probability that there would be multiple cases of young people unexpectedly suffering those very rare event of an unexpected sudden death or other severe event, and that coinciding with that person having had the vaccine within the last 1 or 2 weeks, it's basically zero, the probability that could happen. And so to have the head of the TGA, John Skerritt, as the regulator, seeming not to comprehend that, that was very, very alarming for me. And so I guess it was really from there that has prompted everything that I've been involved in since then.
And how were you able to get away with your letters to the TGA and your were you outspoken at the time? Why didn't they close it down?
Well, I wasn't publicly outspoken at the time in terms of I wasn't using social media. I did what I thought was, I guess, appropriate and necessary, but that was being directed mostly towards officials and colleagues. So I was having discussions with colleagues. For example, I put a copy of that letter and and a post to a closed Facebook forum of, I think there's about 20,000 GPs on that group, and said, does anyone else have concerns? Has anyone else been noticing this?
Yeah.
Would anyone else like to sign this letter with me? And at that time, it sparked a lot of debate. It was, of course, a highly controversial topic, not just from the AHPRA perspective, but I guess coming from the other perspective of most people had, it certainly wasn't everyone that was having a side effect. Even if the rate was as alarmingly high as, say, 1 in 100, then that's 99 people out of every 100 who've had the vaccine have had absolutely no issues. So there's that other aspect of it. And then I think there was that overlying feeling of, well, this is our only way out of the pandemic. What do we do? If we don't have the vaccines, do we stay locked up forever? So the discussions were around all of that, that they were, I think you could characterise them as being quite critical of me at that time, which was okay. I mean, I think debate is important. It's important to know, am I just saying this or are other people saying this? But what was interesting, Russell, was that, again, behind the scenes, I had a number of people contact me privately, a number of doctors contacting me, again, through private messages, through emails and things like that, and who were also very alarmed at what was going on and concerned that it wasn't something that could be easily discussed and that it was being dismissed. So I was confident that what I was seeing, others were seeing. I was concerned at the way that it was being dismissed, and I was concerned that it wasn't something that we could discuss openly. But I really felt that there could be no criticism of my conduct according to the Code of Conduct if what I was doing was simply writing to officials and stating facts and stating what I had observed. I didn't think there was really any controversy about that. So I continued to do that. I followed up in March of 22 with another letter, and that time I had, I think, 15 doctors who did co-sign, so from various specialties from around the country co-signed that. I wrote a letter to AHPRA, to the head of the medical board, perhaps in about May of 22. So I continued to write letters, and but I have now had some issues with AHPRA. So for the first time, I did speak publicly, and that was in February of 23. And at that time, I felt that it was necessary because all my other efforts had just seemed to have failed and fallen on deaf ears. And what I was hearing from patients was that they were still going in to see their doctors, into emergency, in to see specialists, and they were still having their concerns dismissed. They were having their diagnoses were being delayed. There was this continued reluctance to really even discuss the possibility of adverse events. And I was seeing the harm that was doing to patients. And so I felt that it was important to speak more publicly about that.
So you had informed AHPRA very early on of your audit of your patients.
Yes, well, so actually very early on, I wrote to the Ombudsman for AHPRA, actually at the same time that I wrote the letter so it was John Skerritt and Greg Hunt at that time. So at the same time, I wrote a letter to the National Health Practitioner Ombudsman, and I asked them to actually, I sort of was making a complaint about AHPRA, and I gave them all of the same details, wrote the same, sent them a copy of the letter that outlined what I had seen in my patients, what I was concerned about. And what I attempted to raise with the Ombudsman for AHPRA was that AHPRA's position statement, whether this was intended or not, was having the effect of silencing discussion around adverse events, and that this was having consequences for the health and well-being of patients in the Australian public. And of course, that is the role of AHPRA, is to protect the health and well-being of the Australian public. And so I was attempting to raise with them, well, look, here's something that AHPRA themselves have done that is directly, in my observation, affecting the health of the public. And so that was the first thing that I raised with in respect of AHPRA. And I first got a reply that said, thank you for your complaint. We'll be in touch in a couple of weeks for the next steps. So it did seem like perhaps that was going to be taken seriously. But then about a week later, I got an email from someone else within that department that said, this complaint won't be taken any further because we consider that AHPRA's actions are consistent with the national plan. And So, you know, I don't know how the reasoning for that response came about, because of course it's not in keeping with the national plan. I mean, you can read the COVID Shield immunisation plan. Nowhere there does it mention mandatory vaccination or, you know, restrictions around the normal processes of identifying safety signals, etc. So I disagree with that, but that was sort of a dead end. But yeah, I raised it with them, and then I raised specifically with the head of the medical board a few months after that in more detail my concerns, and asked for a meeting, asked if I could speak with them about what I was observing, about the concerns that I had. So that was all sort of 2022.
Right. Where are we today?
Well, today we've yeah, I think we're in this kind of odd situation where there's just such overwhelming evidence of safety concerns about the vaccines, and yet really very little in the way of backtracking the ongoing recommendations for continued boosters and continued dosing of the vaccine. So there's that sort of mismatch, I think, between some of the robust evidence that's come out and the clinical practice in terms of ongoing recommendations for boosters, etc. But outside of that, where we're at now is I suppose, from what I'm involved in, is the legal action that I'm involved in as well. Unfortunately, the vaccination claim scheme, for all of its shortcomings, at least I think it did give people some hope of some compensation if they happened to have a condition that fell within that very limited scope and criteria, and if they'd been admitted to hospital, and if they had doctors who would fill in those forms. And so that was enormous barriers, and a lot of them, to be successful, needed legal help with that, which the scheme was, purported to help avoid that. But for all its failings, at least it was there. Now it's gone as of September 30th. And so what I've been working on since, so the second half of 2022 has been a class action, so a legal action against the TGA and the health department and various decision makers within that. And what the cause of action is negligence and misfeasance or misfeasance in regards to their decisions to approve, and in the ongoing approvals, the safety monitoring of the vaccines, and really that question of, did they act in a reasonable way, given all of the information that they had at the time. That's, I guess, really what that case is about, and that's ongoing.
Dr Melissa McCann, just before we finish up, if you were speaking to the Prime Minister right now, what would you say?
Please suspend these vaccines. Honestly, I don't know what I would say. Just please educate yourself on what has happened. Listen to the stories of patients who've had these significant adverse events. Do some due diligence on the information that's available, and ensure that the departments that you are ultimately, at the head of, are they appropriately doing what they need to do to protect the public health and safety.
Dr Melissa McCann, thanks for being with us today. It's been a pleasure to have you on. I'm sure there's more to your story, but we're out of time. So thank you so much.
Thanks so much for speaking with me, Russell. Great to talk.